Here, can you, is everything?
Okay. She's bringing.
Here, can you, is everything?
Yep, we're here. She's bringing in the, this is the Tuxedo Project group. And they're reading the book as a project.
Here, can you, is everything? That is really exciting.
She's bringing the,
It is so beautiful to see a mother and daughter on a screen. Mother and daughters on screen.
others.
Yeah, mother and daughters. I only have one, but I love nothing more than hanging out with my daughter. So,
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming on in.
hi, everybody.
We are going to start just in a few minutes. We have a busy store where people always want to come in, so we have to lock the door.
Oh,
And I think
afterwards, you can like take me around and show me the inside of the store. I've so much missed going to bookstores. I can't tell you. You know, it's just not the same doing it online. So
We're in our back room now.
okay.
oh, I think this is what I'm.
Okay, so we're here.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're ready. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Friday night at Source Booksellers. As some of you know, we are a small, independent, unique niche of nonfiction books in Midtown Detroit. And tonight, we are really going international because we have a wonderful author with us who is currently in Italy, where it's about 11 o'clock at night. So we want to thank her for either staying up or being up to be with us here in Detroit. And then we have Professor Hillary Jones, who's in Miami, and she's going to be in conversation with our author, Andrea Lee. And thank you, Tuxedo Project, for being here and for using this book as one of your reads for this time period. I have to say that we met Andrea by a screen. She couldn't see us, but we could see her when the publisher had some book talks for us. And we said right away, oh, we want to get her. We want her to come and be a part of our Friday night date night book groups. And here we are. That was some months ago. So I can't believe that it's really coming to pass now. So Allison is going to, do you want to bring in Rose? She's good. Okay. So first of all, I want you to know, right there, my glasses, a little bit about Andrea Lee. She is, her most recent book is Red Island House, which is the one we're going to be in conversation with about today. And it's a novel. And know that Source Booksellers is not against novels, even though we are primarily a nonfiction niche bookstore, that we've always had prize winning or prize writing and some debut novels as well. But Andrea is right in the middle of all that because she was nominated, I think, for a National Book Award for her book, Russian Journal. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And so we keep an eye on those kinds of awards and those kinds of names so that we can be of interest to that part of the literary life of the store. So she was born in Philadelphia and lives now in Italy. Is it Milan or where?
In Torino.
In Torino.
Yeah, Turin.
Turin, yes. Believe it or not, I have been there years and years and years ago. My husband and I traveled to there. Yes. So I have a little feeling about where that is. Also, she's the author of 5 books. And I said, including the National Book Award nomination for Russian Journal. And this is her most recent book, Red Island House. I also want to say that we are pleased to have Hillary Jones, our I should say she's my daughter, living in Miami, and she's a professor of history. Hillary, I think I'm not going to get all this right because you may have to bring it in. Of African history. And we thought that she and Andrea would be a really good match for conversation because Hillary has studied French-speaking West Africa. Madagascar is a French part. And she's written a book and has articles and all kinds of things. So I think she's a great match for a conversation with Andrea. So I want to just go right in and let the two of you begin. Hillary, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it's a pleasure for me to be able to be in conversation with Andrea Lee about this fascinating novel. I just have to tell you that when my mother and sister asked me to do this on Sunday, I thought, how am I going to do this? It's the last week of the semester. I'm grading and teaching and, you know, how will I do this? Then I realized that really they set me up, because they knew there were so many pieces of this novel that I connect with. As an African-American woman who's lived in Senegal, who's done research on French West Africa and on French Empire in Africa and West African societies, and is interested in race and class and gender topics and histories of colonialism and slavery, they knew exactly what they were doing, I think. And as I started to read the novel at the beginning of the week, I couldn't put it down until I finished it. I really got taken by it. And I think one of the reasons for that is because it touched all of these buttons. But specifically, you know, there's my research interests. I'm teaching a class on Blacks in Paris right now. And so we deal a lot with the African-American experience in Europe. But even more than that, it's a novel that's told through the lens of Shay. So I don't want to give too much away, but you know, Shay, who's an African-American woman from the Bay Area, she's a literature professor. So there's a kind of connection to academia in the novel, who's also the spouse of the wife of an Italian businessman named Senna. And they own this house on the fictional island of Naratrani in Madagascar. And in the notes, one of the things that sort of jumped out at me is that the author, Andrea Lee, writes, Red Island House is a novel about foreigners in Madagascar. Its viewpoint and its voice are those of an outsider looking in. The novel is told through the perspective of an African-American woman, but I'm saying this now. In other words, she says that it's the viewpoint and the voice of those of an outsider looking in. But as I read it, I thought, but yes, it's told from the perspective of an African-American woman traveler who's going between Italy and Madagascar and who's rooted in both places. And I couldn't really think of other, I'm sure literary scholars would be able to roll titles off of their tongue, but you know, the closest that I could sort of think of in terms of novels or works that place African-American women as contemporary travelers in this kind of story, but might be Maya Angelou's All God's Women Need Traveling Shoes, which is not fictional. Maybe some of the Harlem Renaissance writers like Nella Larson, who wrote Quicksand in the 1920s. But I don't think we have works that really center African-American women as travelers. So I'd love to just begin this by having you talk more about the introduction, if you want to read for us a bit about the novel, maybe thoughts that you have around the perspective by which you decided to tell this story.
Okay, would you like me to start out by reading? Because I have chosen a part from the beginning, which is just the introduction to the book, which is just the very, very beginning. Well, this book is about, it centers around the life and history of a great big folly of a house that is built on a remote island in Madagascar. So, and this is the very opening chapter of this book. So I'm just going to read to you actually a portion of this chapter, and then we can talk about the ideas of the book and what lies behind it. This chapter is called The Packet War, and it starts out with a quote from the traditional epic of Madagascar, which is a very ancient epic. It's an epic poem that's called the Abonia, and it's just been written down for maybe the last 100 years. But anyway, this is just a verse from it, and the verse is, "I am a big house seen from afar. Not even a whole crowd can take it apart, but if they do, it takes revenge. And when those from across the sea catch sight of me, I add them to my servants." The Packet War. There are houses that you don't want that nevertheless enter your life and bring with them other lives, whole other worlds. There are countries you visit that lay hold of you and don't let go, even if you diligently attempt to remain a tourist. These thoughts have been incubating in the mind of Shea Senna ever since she, a Black American woman, with scant interest in the continent of Africa, except as a near mythical motherland, unexpectedly and unwillingly became mistress of the Red House, a sprawling household in northwestern Madagascar. It is because of the big house and its bad fortune that she is at present in a dreamlike situation, hurrying under the coalescent subequatorial sun through the back lanes of a fisherman's shantytown on the island of Naratrani in pursuit of a tiny Sakalava girl in a white satin gown. In the light-soaked stillness of the hottest noontime hour, when mongrel dogs lie flat as puddles in patches of shade, the barefoot child, who looks like an eerie carnival figure in that glaring white dress with its flounces and ribbons, skips in and out of sight through a maze of tottering bamboo huts. Occasionally, the girl turns her little braided head and makes a cheeky beckoning motion with a spindly brown arm as she guides Shea and Shea's head housekeeper, Bertine Lagrande, to the home of the man referred to, usually in whispers, as the neighbor. The tall, stately Bertine, also barefoot, also Sakalava, leads the way. Dressed in a sweeping print lamba, her geometrically knotted hair hidden by a big, sun-faded newsboy hat that gives her a curiously regal air, she chuckles softly each time the small white apparition flashes into sight, then treads on casually as if engaged in an everyday errand. Shea stumbles along in her wake, hampered by the long skirt she was told to wear, and hobbled as well by her American common sense, which is struggling with the awareness that she has crossed a threshold into the deep unknown. Her woven shoulder bag, concealing a wad of airy bills and the small gift that Bertine suggested, bangs against her side as she tries not to think of the fact that she is seeking out the neighbor, a notorious conjure man, in hopes that he can lift the spell on her house. Anyway, that's the very beginning, the entry of the book, the entry of the problem of the house, the problem of, of this woman who's taking the step into the deep unknown. An African-American woman who is in an African country, though Madagascar is an island, but she realizes that it's not a homeland at all, as it's sometimes romanticized as. She's completely at a loss as to how to deal with with this country. So, that's kind of part of the underlying theme of the book.
I certainly connected to a lot of that description. Mm-hmm. And the way that you sort of introduce us to Shea's world in Madagascar, that she's not naive about it. At least, that's the impression that she's not naive about it. And yet at the same time, there seems to be a kind of discovery of identity or of connections to identity behind it. And so I wonder if you might want to say a word or two about, to me, one of the things that's at the heart of the book is cross-cultural friendships. There's interracial romance, of course. multiracial families, and even you use a reference at one point to third culture kids, I think, which some people may be very familiar with, but I had to learn about that term when I was living in doing research in Senegal, and I was living there for an extended period of time. And a lot of the people who I interacted with were and are American expatriates and expatriates from other countries who've made Senegal their home and whose children are Senegalese. But maybe I just wonder if you might want to say a word or two about, what you hope to kind of communicate by using that sort of grounding.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the book, well, I know it's funny that we writers, I don't think usually set out writing a fictional book with a set idea as to what it's going to be about. It's just kind of, you find what it's going to be about. But now that I've looked it over and thought about it, I realize that there are two interlacing themes in the book that are very important. And one of them, which you sort of suggested to me now, is the whole idea of Shay's adventure. When I was a very little girl, and I think a lot of this comes out of my interest, for my lifelong interests, I was obsessed with adventure stories. I mean, like traditional adventure stories like Conan Doyle's, H. Rider Haggard, all of those adventure stories that usually came out of colonialist England, for example. And I was obsessed with them, but I always yearned to find a story that would have a hero or heroine like me, more like me, and like a little Black girl, not a white man in a pith helmet. So I've spent my entire life reading and rereading these stories and finding, you can find out all sorts of unpleasant things in them. You can find still mystery and fascination about the idea of an adventure, and usually it's a white man from a certain period of time going into this unknown place, and can be very often is Africa, say the darkest part of Africa. So in a way, I find that as the book developed, I found that Shay was the main figure. She's kind of me and not me. But I realized that a lot of the book is Shay's kind of voyage or journey into herself and into finding out what more about this particular country, Madagascar, understanding that she could never really presume to understand it, but she can learn to respect it. But she could also learn to understand her own privilege. Mm-hmm. She has to be honest with herself about her motives, her privilege, her values. When she first arrives there, I mean, she's a very privileged person. She grew up in Oakland. Her family is very middle class. They are very politically progressive. She, is raising her children to be aware. She thinks she has it all together. And then suddenly, just because of the peculiar nature of her husband, her marriage is kind of a collision of cultures. She finds herself in a place that she cannot for the life of her really comprehend at the beginning. And she can't cheaply think, oh yes, this is Africa, I'm back in the homeland. No, it's not. And so she tries to be a tourist. She tries not to take things seriously, but she finds herself from the beginning, as we see in this beginning chapter, she's drawn deeply into the unknown. So that's the beginning of her journey. And I think toward the middle of the book, she begins really to understand her own motives, her own privilege, how I don't know how she can possibly live in between cultures, but respect this country that she's having an ongoing encounter with. So that's, that is part of the book. I wanted to think that I'm taking a swashbuckling story and turning it inside out, sort of subverting it. So we don't have a white man in a pith helmet, we have a Black woman who doesn't want to be there, but she is there and she is having her adventure.
And that's what I think is so illuminating and important, that there is a perspective there that we don't hear that often. And yet Shay as the character shows us all these levels of her internal journey, but also this external adventure, the external traveler, the way that she's moving between different social groups, culture groups, language groups. And so I can really appreciate that and that voice in the novel. Let's talk about the setting a little bit. Madagascar, which is on my list of places to go sometime in my life. I've not been to the Indian Ocean side of Africa. I think many people, when they think of, I think even you say this, perhaps you say this in the book, at one point that when especially Americans think of Madagascar, they might think of the DreamWorks animation movies.
Yes.
You know, it's all animals and flora and fauna and exotic paradise. And you say at one point in the book, it's sort of like the way we reference Timbuktu. It's this place that's far, far away and over there and maybe unknowable in a kind of way. And yet in the novel, Madagascar itself is really, Madagascar as place is very central to what you're writing about. So I wonder if you'd like to just share a little bit with us about why Madagascar, how you approach this sort of idea of Madagascar as paradise in your writing.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, I'm married to an Italian like Shay, but I'm not Shay. But and my husband has had a lifelong passion for diving. Now over here, we're closer to the Indian Ocean than we might be to the Caribbean. So I've been dragged along for years and years. I mean, I actually like it myself, to far-flung places, far-flung tropical places, and particularly in the Indian Ocean. And Madagascar was one of the first places we visited together. And it's a place we've come back to many times, to different islands off the coast of Madagascar. Madagascar is a vast island in itself, 30 million people. I mean, it's hard to believe. It's one of the biggest islands in the world. So it's a huge country, but it has a remoteness to it, even in terms, I've spoken to West Africans about it, and people just find it mysterious and enigmatic. You know, I spoke to there's a Ghanaian woman who lives, I believe she's Ghanaian, and I might be wrong, who lives in Madagascar on a coffee plantation, whom I spoke to, who's lived there for years. And she said to me, she said, but I've never understood them. They're so mysterious. They're just enigmatic, these Malagazis. So, you know, so there's a very distinct flavor to the fact that it's insular, although there are 19 different tribes. It's quite quite remote in some ways from continental Africa. And there is unique wildlife, though no dancing zebras, because it was detached from the larger continent millions and millions of years ago. So it developed its own remarkable wildlife with lemurs and chameleons, things that don't exist anywhere else. But anyway, we began to go there and know people there and stay there. And at one point, early in my acquaintance with Madagascar, in a city in the north, it's called Diego Suarez, and it's in its Portuguese. It's in its Portuguese fashion. I mean, that it's still officially called that. But I saw a pizzeria that had a pirate's face painted on the sign, and it was called Libertalia. I thought, what is this? And I heard that I was immediately told by Malagasy people, by Italians, by French people, that there was a famous legend that pirates from Europe, English and French pirates, had come to Madagascar in the 1600s and founded a colony in Madagascar that was a utopian colony, that they could do whatever they wanted to. They were free. It was Libertalia. They were liberi. And so, it was this, this wonderful place where pirates could just do whatever they wanted to without rules or laws. And of course, it lasted a very, very short time and was completely burnt down and destroyed after a while by the locals, who just got sick of this, sick of these intruders. And so, and it's only, it's written about in one or two places. And so no one quite knows if it actually existed, although there were many pirates from Europe who came and settled on the coasts of Madagascar. So that began to fascinate me, the whole idea that someone would have an ideal that they could just live in paradise, do whatever they wanted to do. And of course it ends badly. So I began to store that story in my mind, and then look at other people who also tried to settle in what they thought was eternal vacation. So that's kind of the beginning of my thinking about writing about Madagascar.
I just had to unmute myself. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I was thinking to myself, I think many people, well, I shouldn't say many people. I feel like I probably I'm probably part of a group of people who've had the experience of kind of witnessing that kind of a, how do I put it? Community, right? You know, or those kinds of remnants of historical pasts that are still quite present, and especially in places like, not everywhere, but those on the African continent that have had this like long history of European interaction
Yes.
and engagement. Or even, you know, Madagascar is such a fascinating place too, because it's in this Indian Ocean world that was the site of a lot of comings and goings over centuries and centuries and centuries. One of the things that I also found sort of fascinating about the book is that you don't take history for granted. In the book, you know, one could write a book like this and maybe the historical context is the background. As a historian, my eyes are always very tuned up to understanding how even fictional works deal with time and historical context and meanings. And one of the things that really interested me about the novel is that through the lives of the characters that you introduce us to, we learn about French colonialism. We learn about Africa's colonial past. We learn about the racism of colonialism, the legacies of that colonial past and the legacies of colonial racism. It's not, I think for those of us who have, you know, had the experience of doing long-term research in places on the African continent, a lot of the sort of parts of the book where you make reference to those connections, whether it's Italian, the Italian colonies in the Horn of Africa, or Zimbabwe, the settler colonies in South Africa and Cape Town. There's a way in which you really make the connections between Madagascar's present and Madagascar's past. So I'm wondering if you might like to talk a little bit here about the research you had to do, or the research that you did for the book, because, you know, I see it as a historian. I can see where there's a depth there to the historical connections that you make.
Well, thank you. You know, that's very flattering to me, because I feel like I did sort of haphazard, because I am not a scholar, I'm a writer. And but I also felt deeply that, first of all, I didn't really want to write this book. It took me a long time to write it, because I felt, again, that I don't speak Malagasy. It's one of the hardest languages I've ever approached. And I thought for a long time it was very disrespectful of me to even imagine writing a book about Madagascar, because I felt like you need to speak a language. You need really to delve deeply into a country before you can write about it. And the only way I was able to do it is by taking the standpoint of an outsider, an eternal outsider. So, but I also felt like I should do as much reading, as much research as I could possibly do. But I obviously didn't want to turn it into any kind of research book. But I felt like, it's interesting. I was just reading a book about Helen Frankenfaller, the painter, and she did a lot of staring at old master paintings before she could do her abstract expressionist paintings. Not that she actually put the shapes of the old master paintings on her canvas, but she knew that they were there. And a lot of the time I wanted to know that I knew things about, you know, what actually had happened in Madagascar. So without necessarily always having to, you know, footnote it or put it, you know, all out there on the page, but I wanted to be able to casually allude to it and know that I was not being disrespectful or ignorant. So what did I do? I just started reading haphazardly at first. I read whatever I could read in French, usually, but in French, records of missionaries. The French and the English kind of battled for control of Madagascar for a really long time. And so there are lots and lots of, you know, of records. Very often there is a religious, you know, there were kind of religious, not wars, but religious little conflicts between different, you know, different groups who wanted to take control of, you know, take religious and spiritual control of the Malagasy. And these missionaries would come to Madagascar and become fascinated, as everyone does, because it's so beautiful. It's kind of magical. And so they wrote lots and lots of diaries. They became amateur naturalists. They wrote poetry. And there are all these dusty, decaying volumes of their endless writing on Madagascar. You know, folklorists So I dug around in those volumes and I found some of them in Madagascar. I found others online in Italy. Italians, didn't come until recently. I read slavers' journals, translated them from the Dutch, because there are a lot of Dutch slavers who especially went gathered slaves in southern Madagascar and took them to Mauritius, although some of them actually shipped them to the States as well, the United States. And I've also heard to Brazil. So I read slavery journals. There are one or two amazing memoirs of men from Europe who were shipwrecked on Madagascar and became prisoners of Malagasy kings, because Malagasy was a series of little kingdoms at a certain point. So these men, there was an Englishman, Robert Drury, who became like the slave of he was a white man who became the slave of this Malagasy despot in southern Madagascar. That was fascinating. And I read a lot of annals of pirates, because pirates loved Madagascar. And that's part of the Libertalia myth. And there's a book particularly that's called The History of the Pirates by a Captain Charles Johnson, that I believe it was published in 1724. That's all about pirates from England and France. But these pirates used to go back and forth between the Caribbean and Madagascar. They loved both sides of the world. And they wrote great, they wrote quite a lot about their stays in Madagascar. They would always settle down for a while, then they'd get tired of raiding the Indian Ocean and go back to the Caribbean. So there's that book that's just fascinating. And that's where the story of Libertalia came from. So I did very random research, but I tried hard to get an idea in my mind of what the history was. And I read a lot of Malagasy literature in translation in French, and because there's very little translated in English. There's a beautiful novel that just came out 2 years ago, the first translated into English, Beyond the Rice Fields by Naivo. But I did a lot of reading of poetry, because they're an incredibly literate and with a long, long literary tradition. I think they have the first literary journal in all of continental Africa, in all of Africa. Was founded in Madagascar. So there's a rich tradition of poetry, of proverbs, of love poetry. It's beautiful. So I did as much as I could without actually speaking more than a few words of Malagasy, to my shame. But but I thought that, you have to be respectful if you're going to be writing about a place now. So
it comes across in the novel, and it made me, in just your conversation, I would also recalled for me a colleague of mine, whose name is Wendy Wilson Fall, wrote anthropological book, so through the lens of anthropology, about memories of Madagascar among enslaved Africans in the Americas, and particularly in North America.
I would love to read that. So, oh my goodness.
Yeah, I'll share that with you. But and I was also thinking, because Shay is at the center of it, she is observing of this. She sees a kind of similarity, but she also sees the difference, right? This isn't the same history, but there are ways in which she sees herself as implicated in it and part of it and connected to it. So really, interesting connections there. I could probably say a whole lot more, but I'm going to be quiet right now, because I'm sure we have participants and people in the audience who would love to get in here and ask questions, have comments. I'm guessing I'm supposed to field those questions, which I understand may be in the chat or in the Q&A. So if I don't see any, but perhaps if, and there's also, looks like there's a raise your hand button. At least I see it.
Is there something I should be doing, or no?
No, not at all. I was just checking to see, but I don't see any questions yet. But I am going to put it out to our audience of participants, who maybe some who have started to read the book or who are interested in the book, but haven't purchased it or haven't started to read it. If you have any comments or questions or even observations about the subject matter of the book, and any maybe connections that you hear as we've sort of talked about some of the themes, in the book, those themes of traveler. I'm sure there's travelers out here among us, or identity, third culture kids. I see greetings from Wilma Jean Randall, who is in Dakar and is part of my little Senegal group of people. And she says, thank you, Hillary, for sending us this link. And I did in part because I knew that she would connect to this, that much of the novel is very familiar to the sort of African-American expatriate experience in a place like Senegal. Frank Rashid says hi to Andrea. And so Wilma Jean has a question to panelists. I think I'll read it because I'm not sure if everyone will see this, but I know you may not see this. So Wilma Jean, this is Wilma Jean Randall says, so I want to say that I read Ms. Lee's Sarah Phillips novel back in the 1980s, right around the time that I was starting to do solo traveling. Loved it, very much looking forward to reading this new book. I'm teaching English literature to high school students. Many of them are TCKs. So have two questions. One, do you have an audience in mind for this book? And I will just also mention here that she's the person who educated me about TCKs, the third culture kids. Do you have an audience in mind?
No, you know something, I really don't. I mean, if I did, my ideal audience would be somebody like you, somebody who's interested in this whole idea of the flow of confronting other cultures, of mixture and flow. No, I don't. I can't say. I would say it would be somebody like the people that I'm talking to in this audience, because it's. That's always been my life, and the whole idea, though I'm very firmly American and grounded. I was born in Philadelphia. My father was a minister. I have these roots that I alternately write about, but at the same time, I come from a family of avid travelers, and I've always been kind of, moving back and forth. Yeah. So it's always this. So the people I know tend to be people like you, maybe, or who are connected to other countries and have this sense that we're living between always. So I guess it would be for people like that. But I can't say. It seems to be, a lot of people seem to like, a lot of different kinds of people seem to like this book. So I'm always surprised. But I guess it would be more like people like you, people who know other cultures and get it.
Well, that's what's fascinating. And again, I don't think that perspective is put forward that much in our sort of literary life, or maybe even in popular culture images, the African-American women who are living abroad, right? Even more than just the tourist experience, but are living abroad. So her second question is this. And two, how long did it take you to write this?
No, that's, I think I said before that I didn't want to write this book because I honestly felt that I didn't have the right to, the RIGHT, to write this book, because I just felt as if it should be someone who was specialized, who had actually studied Madagascar, not someone who was having a series, as I said, an ongoing series of encounters there. And I've been back and forth, many, many times. I've lived there, stayed there, but, not actually ever settled there. So I had some stories of Madagascar, maybe even back as far as 10 years ago, but I was kind of gathering these stories in my mind, jotting down scenes I had, and then I began to think of it as, because I couldn't resist, because these situations would present themselves to me. I would see how they fitted together into a story. As you know, and you see all kinds of things in this situation where people think that they have found paradise. It's such a fascinating thing. It always ends so weirdly, generally. So I would, as a writer, I couldn't help but pick up all of these anecdotes, stories. So I stored them away. I began to write a few short stories. In my book, Interesting Women, I have a short story about Madagascar that is much more simplistic, I think, than this book is. And so I began to, I was always collecting it, but then it was only about 3 years ago that I put them together and thought, okay, there has to be a main character and point of view. And that was Shay. And Shay was basically me, but also she's the lens through which, you begin to see all of these things. So before, the stories were kind of random. So I would say it took about 10 years. It took a long time because I didn't want, as I said, I didn't want to write it because I did not think I was equipped to write about another culture.
Books they incubate for a long time often. I
Yeah.
want to read this question from Frank Rashid because it speaks directly to the question you were just answering, or what you were just answering, but I think, you might want to expand a little bit more on this. It's a wonderful question. Frank Rashid writes, when you visited Marygrove in Detroit in 2015, you mentioned that if you were writing about Madagascar at that point, you would treat some things differently than in your earlier stories. How do you think Red Island Girl is different than your earlier work about Madagascar?
Oh, okay. That's so interesting. Yeah. No, I definitely felt that. All right. So when I went to Marygrove in 2015, which just seems like yesterday, I had not really begun to put the book together yet. I had all these collected anecdotes, but I read Brothers and Sisters Around the World, which is the Malagasy story. And oddly enough, there had been a situation at Marygrove where I thought I was going to be reading to college students, but I was actually reading to high school students. So I began to read that story, which I like, to them. And I began to feel embarrassed as I read it because I thought that I treated the two women in the book, by, just talk about these two hussies on the beach. I thought I treated them disrespectfully in that story. As I read it, I began to feel that I was not thinking, through them, that I was not really, I didn't really, I think I made a mistake even about what kinds of the names of their ethnic groups. I made some ignorant errors in that story. And I thought it was kind of it's a good story, but I thought it was very shallow as I read it to these high schoolers. And I thought, I even said it to them. because I began to think, how have I come across to these women, these young women that I'm talking about, these Malagasy women, with such flippancy, that it's, so I began to think about that when I read the story to them. And I began to want to expound, to go more deeply and more respectfully, like the word respect keeps coming back to me, more respectfully, more deeply into that culture, into that country, that culture, with more sympathy. And so that's, that's, when I'm reading that story, it was kind of a trigger for me to it kind of helped me move along in my book, as a matter of fact. So.
Yeah. And it sounds like it also did that work of really helping you to revisit the societies that make up the place, and beyond like the surface level, but to
Absolutely.
really kind of go more deeply down into the communities of the place.
Yeah, and respecting them, and identifying. I really did a lot of checking on this book, so much, to try to make sure that things were correct, and things, that things were spelled right, that things were in their places. I'm sure I missed lots of things, but I tried really hard. So
I don't see another question right now, but I invite people to reflect and to think about it. I know there are a few East Africanists, or people who study East Africa in the participants. But while we're sort of reflecting and thinking, I do want to acknowledge that the Tuxedo Project is here, and they are also part of this event this evening. And I hope I'm not taking too many liberties here, but if there's someone from the Tuxedo Project who would like to introduce yourselves and explain a little bit about who you are and what you do, I think we'd be glad to hear from you.
I'd love to hear someone.
Thanks, Hillary. And thank you so much for joining us, Andrea.
Hi.
I'm really looking forward to reading this novel. The Tuxedo Project, for folks who aren't familiar with us, we are a neighborhood-based literary and community center on the west side of Detroit. And Source Booksellers is a huge part of our reading and writing program, where we have monthly reading and discussion groups. We basically do deep dives into some of our favorite books. And instead of just discussing it for maybe like one session, we'll actually discuss it weekly for about a month. So programs like this, where we actually get to not only read together, but also get to discuss with the writer. It's a treat for us. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll be doing a few more reading and discussion groups coming up this summer. So we'll be sharing that with source booksellers, and we hope folks who are in the space tonight will check us out, tuxedoproject.org. And you can sign up for the programs there too.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
It's all Miss Janet and Allison.
Thank you. I got to listen in on a Tuxedo Project collaboration another time, and it was really a lot of fun. So thank you for that. We have a question from Julia Brown.
Yeah, okay.
And Julia, I'll read the question. And Julia says, this book is stunning, Andrea. I was captivated by the generosity and expansiveness in the narrative voice in this novel. One character I think about all the time is Noeline. I would love to hear you say more about Noeline and her trajectory and how women acquire power in this setting.
Interesting. Well, the interesting thing is when I was writing Noeline, I didn't like her so much. And then I came to admire her. Noeline is the character who kind of, she starts out with very little on the island, and she becomes the lover of two, not one, but two old foreign men, and kind of makes her way to basically through their passion for her. So it makes her way to prosperity and eventual financial independence, running her own store, being a woman of power on the island. And so it's interesting because she's kind of an amalgam of situations that people and situations that I saw in various parts of Madagascar. But I didn't much like her when I was first writing about her, but as I began to write more about her and see, how, where she was going, having the power over these men who are, white men in the tropics, so presumably powerful, she becomes far more powerful in a certain way, and getting them to, into humiliating situations in which she ends up on top. I began to admire her more and more as kind of a symbol of feminine power on that island. And somebody said to me the other day that a lot of the stories deal with power and with women's power in particular. And actually, another of my characters, Bertine, who's Shay's kind of best friend. She's kind of an alter ego in some way. She's the person who is rooted in the country and kind of knows more than Shay does. She's the person of depth, the person who's from there, and Shay is the outsider. But Bertine says several times, women are the one who count. Women are the ones who count. Women are the ones who really have the power. And this is something I just constantly heard, and I just put it in, but I put it in as something that a character like Bertine would say. But I realized that looking through the stories, there are a great many discussions or examples of female power throughout the book, and Noeline is certainly one of them. And I actually came to like her a lot more toward the end of the story. So.
Absolutely, and the character of Noeline really that's a fascinating relationship between Noeline and Shay. And the relationship between Shay and Bertine, just like, I won't give it away because I won't give it away for those who have not read it, but it's such a beautiful friendship. And I think, and you capture there the ways in which friendships between women can be made across these cultural divides, across nationality, language, ethnicity, and that there's a very intimate knowing between the two of them. And yet Shay is also aware that she can't know all, or there's a certain kind of remove. There's a passage that I really loved in the novel, and I would not dare put my words in your mouth. I would not dare read it, but there's a passage at the end of the chapter, it's around page 214, that's quite beautiful, where Shay is reflecting back on their 20 or so years of friendship. The novel follows these relationships, or this relationship in particular, over a long span of time. They have children, they, come to know each other as younger people and then as older people. And so if I could indulge my own self, I wonder if you might read that passage on page 214.
See if I can find it.
Okay.
Let's see, 214. And I'll tell you something.
It's the last page of the chapter, and she gets news.
Oh yeah, she gets, so you want the last paragraph, is that right?
Yeah, yes, I think it starts, let's see if I have it, with, she has always associated Bertine with shadows.
All right, so it's also, oh yes, okay. She's always associated Bertine with shadows, but the truth is that they were each other's shadow. Shay was a rootless outsider whose life of privilege carried with it blindness, pride, and scattershot ignorance. And Bertine was the one who belonged, who saw, and who brought order by naming things for what they were, who taught Shay that light and darkness, like wealth and poverty, like foreigner and native born, are indisseverably joined to each other, as are giving and receiving. Deep in her heart, deep in Shay's heart, which unlike Bertine's great heart, has not been broken by the incessant toil of love, Shay recognizes that this truth is a sister's gift that will last. No matter, she thinks, how many of her own years remain to be counted like small stones in a bottle. Yeah, that was a very close relationship, Shay and Bertine, and that's kind of at the heart of the book. So no, I did have a dear friend who is Malagasy, who is based, whom Bertine is based on. So that is one of the very truest, elements of the book. So it's and the interesting thing, and I'll just add this, which I've never said to anyone recently, that my friend who did in fact did pass away. And so my friend, my dear Malagasy friend did pass away. And I have always been unable to make it to her remote grave. It's like, but my son, who just was visiting Madagascar and is kind of down there now, did make a long journey over land and sea, through jungle, wading across rivers. And he came to the most remote mountainside in the heart of the country. And there he said, he and my friend's son, they sat down, they drank, they poured out drinks for the spirits of the ancestors, and they just had a conversation about me and about them and with my dear friends. So it was, it was almost like this book was continuing and being in reality. It was just a beautiful thing. So that is really at the heart of the book. This is this dear friendship. So yeah, and it's very unexpected and you talk about privilege. I mean, one is privileged to have a friendship with someone from such a different culture and feel that it is actually a real friendship, though you can't ever know or presume to know everything. So
yeah, the genuineness comes through. And I think that, without knowing that backstory, it's clear that those kinds of bonds are forged even when there is, part of the novel, in an earlier part of the novel, there's a recognition that Bertine lives a harder life. She lives a life in which she, works day to day and very physically demanding kind of, and that, she is, her home is a country that has a kind of economic, there are economic inequalities there that mean that the lifespan may not be as long, or that one is, there was a beautiful, part about how she's always very stately and healthy, but then this disease one time, chikungunya, swept through, and, it affected her, as can happen, right? It's very, I think many of us around the world are now quite more attuned to the ways in which a disease can ravage otherwise healthy people. And so, I like how the novel navigates that kind of line, and hearing you reflect on that shows that friendship goes beyond the two of them to their children, perhaps the next generation or the next generation. So thank you for reading that and for indulging me, because I thought it was just such a beautiful passage.
Thank you for picking it out. It was fun. It's nice to see it through another person's eyes. So yeah. So anyway, the one last thing I wanted to say about this is that, as I said, I didn't really want to write this book, but I always felt when I was in Madagascar that I saw, first of all, there's a kind of sadness to Red Island House. I mean, I don't know, there's a sadness in general about the idea of this incredibly beautiful place, which is Madagascar, being always invaded, always ravaged in a certain way. And I always felt that when I was there, like something was crying. I don't think I say this in the book, but it was as if there's just this feeling of, so I felt after a while compelled to say something. I mean, I don't, it's not like I needed to save the country or something, because I certainly haven't done anything like that, but I felt that I needed to speak about it, to write about it. And just because it came to me that I had to do it, though disrespectful as it might be not to speak the language. So I tried my hardest to navigate that in this book.
Yeah, and it can be heard through Shay's voice. I really think that. I'll turn everything over now to Allison and Janet of Source Booksellers. I would like to say mom, but Allison and Janet.
My daughter here. This is so great to see you three together. It's just a delight.
Well, thank you very much, Hillary and Andrea. My goodness, this is the book, everybody. It's a beautiful book. I wanted to ask you to say a little bit about the cover. I'm always taken by cover design, and I know they reflect the insides of the book, but I want to bring that to the attention of everybody, that's the cover, the book. And I don't know if we spoke about Hillary's book. I don't know if she wants me to do this, but
I want to read
The Métis of Senegal, foraging urban life in the politics in West Africa. And then as we were talking, I had to go and get a map, because, when we talk about places, we don't always know. So I think if I point to Italy, is my finger nearby?
No.
Madagascar. Wait a second. Wait, bring a little further down to Madagascar. There it is.
To give people an idea as to where things are. Because when you said the Italians went to Madagascar, I said, my goodness, how did they get there? I had to make my mind figure out what the geography was to get there.
Tourists down there now. It's really fascinating. I don't know exactly why, but it kind of is. So, but it feels quite remote from America. That's for sure.
It does.
Yeah.
So tell us about the cover, if you can, just for.
Oh, I can't really even tell. It's an artist. I should know the name of the artist. Someone from Scribner's, and I just fell in love with it. It's he, and I believe it's a he. And I swear I'll find out the name. Just presented this to me, and I loved it from the beginning. I just thought it was so beautiful. And I just made one little change, which is that I changed the palm trees on the cover to reflect the palms that are the national symbol of Madagascar. If you look in the very side of the eye on island, you'll see a tiny little Malagasy palm that's like a hand. And that is a Ravenala palm tree that is the symbol of the country. But I just loved it from the start because it seemed to reflect everything that was in the book. So. And we really need to find out the name of the artist but anyway, thank you for liking it. And my next one is going to be a memoir, so that I'm writing now. So.
Awesome.
Well, thank you each very much. Your responses, your reading, your questions, your comments, and I just feel like travel always takes us places where we don't know that we're going, and certainly travel through books does that. And I'm so pleased that Hillary agreed to do this at the last minute, but boy, she really did it. And thank you, Andrea, for all the way from Italy at a late time to share. I just think that there's nothing like books, and there's nothing like people who write books and enjoy books and participate in books, because they really open us up and free our mind and keep us moving through our human experience together. So Thank you, Andrea. Thank you,
Well,
Helen.
thank you for having a fascinating discussion for me. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes.
This really woke me up, by the way, too. So it was exciting and interesting to answer these questions. And Hillary, I would so much like, I'm going to get your book, and I would so much like to talk to you again in the future about all of this. So, and thank you. And the next time I come to Detroit, I will definitely come. Okay. And you're invited to Italy whenever things open up. So
Okay, yes.
Thank you.
I'll
Thank
stay
you,
in touch.
Tuxedo Project. Rose, are you on to say a last word? You're gone. Okay.
Yep.
All righty.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. The books are on sourcebooksellers.online.com, and we still have some left, and we'll have more coming in. So we're very excited to host you. We know that it's late at night, so we're keeping it to 1 hour so you can get your rest.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you, Andrea.
Okay, let's stay in touch. Okay, thanks so
Right.
much.
Okay.
Thank you again. It was delightful. Thank
Yeah.
you. Bye,
Thank you, everybody.
guys. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right, I'll write to you. Bye. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.